The Seminole Wars, also known as the Florida Wars, were three conflicts in Florida between the Seminole, the collective name given to the amalgamation of various groups of Native Americans and African Americans who settled in Florida in the early 18th century, and the United States Army. The First Seminole War was from 1816 to 1819, the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842, and the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858. Taken together, the Seminole Wars were the longest and most expensive Indian wars in United States history. The First Seminole War arose out of tensions relating to General Andrew Jackson's excursions into northern Spanish Florida against the Seminoles. Beginning in 1816, the governments of Britain and Spain both expressed outrage over the invasion, but ultimately, the Spanish crown agreed to cede Florida to the United States in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. According to the Treaty of Moultrie Creek of 1823, the Seminoles were required to leave northern Florida and were confined to a large reservation in the center of the Florida Peninsula. The Second Seminole War was the result of the United States government attempting to force the Seminoles to leave Florida altogether as described in the Treaty of Payne's Landing of 1832, which Seminole leaders claimed that they signed under duress. Battles and skirmishes raged throughout the Florida Peninsula, with the outgunned and outnumbered Seminoles often using guerrilla warfare tactics and both sides massacring civilians during the conflict. The war eventually resulted in most of the Seminole population in Florida being killed in battle, ravaged by starvation and disease, or relocated to Indian Territory in modern Oklahoma. A few hundred Seminoles were allowed to remain in an unofficial reservation in southwest Florida. The Third Seminole War was again the result of Seminoles responding to settlers encroaching on the lands, perhaps deliberately to provoke a violent response. Chief Billy Bowlegs led a raid near Fort Myers in December 1855, beginning a conflict which consisted mainly of Seminole raids and American reprisals, with no large battles fought. In 1858, most of the remaining Seminoles, weary of war and with the villages and farms mostly destroyed, agreed to be shipped to Oklahoma in exchange for promises of safe passage and cash payments to the chiefs. An estimated 100 Seminoles still refused to leave and moved deep into the Florida Everglades to live on land that was unwanted by white settlers. Background: Colonial Florida. The indigenous peoples of Florida declined significantly in number after the arrival of Europeans in the region. The Native Americans had little resistance to diseases newly introduced from Europe. Spanish suppression of native revolts further reduced the population in northern Florida. By 1707, colonial soldiers from the province of Carolina and the Yamasee Indian allies had killed or carried off nearly all the remaining native inhabitants, having conducted a series of raids extending the full length of the peninsula. In the first decade of the 18th century, 12,000 Indians were taken as slaves according to the governor of La Florida, and by 1710, observers noted that North Florida was virtually depopulated. The few remaining natives fled west to Pensacola and beyond or east to the vicinity of St. Augustine. In 1763, when Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris, the Spanish took the few surviving Florida Indians with them to Cuba and New Spain. Bands from various Native American tribes from the southeastern United States began moving into the unoccupied lands of Florida. In 1715, the Yamasee moved into Florida as allies of the Spanish after conflicts with the English colonies. Creek people, at first primarily the Lower Creek but later including Upper Creek, also also started moving into Florida from the area of Georgia. The Miccosukee Hitchiti speakers settled around what is now Lake McCaskey near Tallahassee. Another group of Hitchiti speakers, led by Cowkeeper, settled in what is now Alachua County, an area where the Spanish had maintained cattle ranches in the 17th century. One of the best-known ranches was Rancho de Alachua. The region became known as the Alachua Prairie. The Spanish in St. Augustine began calling the Alachua Creek cimarrones, which roughly meant wild ones or runaways. This was the probable origin of the term Seminole. This name was eventually applied to the other groups in Florida, although the Indians still regarded themselves as members of different tribes. Other Native American groups in Florida during the Seminole Wars included the Choctaw Uchiah Spanish Indians, so called because it was believed that they were descended from Caloosa's, and Rancho Indians, who lived at Spanish-Cuban fishing camps on the Florida coast. Escaped African and African American slaves who could reach the fort were essentially free. Many were from Pensacola. Some were free citizens, though others had escaped from United States territory. The Spanish offered the slaves freedom and land in Florida. They recruited former slaves as militia to help defend Pensacola and Fort Mose. Other escaped slaves joined various Seminole bands as free members of the tribe, while most of the former slaves at Fort Mose went to Cuba with the Spanish when they left Florida in 1763. Others lived with and near various bands of Indians. Slaves continued to escape from the Carolinas and Georgia and make their way to Florida. The blacks who stayed with or later joined the Seminoles became integrated into the tribes, learning the languages, adopting the dress, and intermarrying. Some of the black Seminoles, as they were called, became important tribal leaders. Early conflict. During the American Revolution, the British, who controlled Florida, recruited Seminoles to raid frontier settlements in Georgia. The confusion of war allowed more slaves to escape to Florida. The British promised slaves freedom for fighting with them. These events made the Seminoles enemies of the new United States. In 1783, as part of the treaty ending the Revolutionary War, Florida was returned to Spain. Spain's grip on Florida was light, as it maintained only small garrisons at St. Augustine, St. Mark's and Pensacola. They did not control the border between Florida and the United States. Miccosukee and other Seminole groups still occupied towns on the United States side of the border, while American squatters moved into Spanish Florida. The British had divided Florida into East Florida and West Florida in 1763, a division retained by the Spanish when they regained Florida in 1783. West Florida extended from the Apalachicola River to the Mississippi River. Together with the possession of Louisiana, the Spanish controlled the lower reaches of all of the rivers draining the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains. It prohibited the U.S. from transport and trade on the lower Mississippi. In addition to its desire to expand west of the mountains, the United States wanted to acquire Florida. It wanted to gain free commerce on western rivers, and to prevent Florida from being used as a base for possible invasion of the U.S. by a European country. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 put the mouth of the Mississippi River in U.S. hands, but much of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi and Tennessee were drained by rivers that passed through east or west Florida to reach the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. claimed that the Louisiana Purchase had included West Florida west of the Perdido River, while Spain claimed that West Florida extended to the Mississippi River. Patriot War in 1810. American residents of West Florida's Baton Rouge district overthrew the local Spanish authorities, seized the corresponding fort, and requested protection from the United States. President James Madison authorized William C. Claiborne, governor of the Territory of Orleans, to seize West Florida from the Mississippi River to as far east as the Perdido River. Claiborne only occupied the area west of the Pearl River, aka the Baton Rouge District. Madison sent George Matthews to deal with the disputes over West Florida. When an offer to turn the remainder of Florida Occidental over to the U.S. was rescinded by the governor, Matthews traveled to Florida Oriental to incite a rebellion similar to that in the Baton Rouge District. The residents of East Florida were happy with the status quo, so the U.S. raised a force of volunteers in Georgia with a promise of free land. On the 13th of March 1812, this force of patriots, with the aid of some U.S. Navy gunboats, seized Fernandina. Although the seizure of Fernandina was initially authorized by President Madison, he later disavowed it. The Patriots were, however, unable to take the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine. The increasing tensions and the approach of war with Great Britain led to an end of the American incursion into East Florida. In 1813, an American force succeeded in seizing the Mobile District from the Spanish. Before the Patriot Army withdrew from Florida, the Seminoles, as allies of the Spanish, began to attack them. First Seminole War. The beginning and ending dates for the First Seminole War are not firmly established. The U.S. Army infantry indicates that it lasted from 1814 until 1819. The U.S. Navy Naval Historical Center gives dates of 1816 to 1818. Another Army site dates the war as 1817 to 1818. Finally, the unit history of the 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery describes the war as occurring solely in 1818. Creek War and the Negro Fort. During the Creek War, Colonel Andrew Jackson became a national hero after his victory over the Creek Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. After his victory, Jackson forced the Treaty of Fort Jackson on the Creek, resulting in the loss of much Creek territory in southern Georgia and central and southern Alabama. As a result, many Creek left Alabama and Georgia and moved to Spanish West Florida. The Creek refugees joined the Seminole of Florida. In 1814, Britain was still at war with the United States, and saw merit in recruiting Indian allies. In May 1814, a British force entered the mouth of the Apalachicola River, and distributed arms to the Seminole and Creek warriors, and fugitive slaves. The British moved upriver and began building a fort at Prospect Bluff. A company of Royal Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Nichols, were to subsequently arrive, but were invited to relocate to Pensacola in late August 1814. It was estimated by Captain Lockyer of HMS Sophie that in August 1814 there were 1,000 Indians at Pensacola, of whom 700 were warriors. 2 months after the British and their Indian allies were beaten back from an attack on Fort Bowyer near Mobile, a U.S. force led by General Jackson drove the British out of Pensacola and back to the Apalachicola River. They managed to continue work on the fort at Prospect Bluff. When the War of 1812 ended, all the British forces left the Gulf of Mexico except for Lieutenant Colonel Nichols and his force in Spanish West Florida. He directed the provisioning of the fort at Prospect Bluff with cannon, muskets and ammunition. He told the Indians that the Treaty of Ghent guaranteed the return of all Indian lands lost during the War of 1812, including the Creek lands in Georgia and Alabama. As the Seminoles were not interested in holding a fort, they returned to the villages. Before Nichols left in the spring of 1815, he turned the fort over to the fugitive slaves and Seminoles whom he had originally recruited for possible incursions into U.S. territory during the war. As word spread in the American Southeast about the fort, whites called it the Negro Fort. The Americans worried that it would inspire the slaves to escape to Florida. A revolt, after a garrison of the Negro fort killed a group of American sailors, General Jackson decided to destroy it, acknowledging that it was in Spanish territory. In April 1816, he informed Governor José Masso of West Florida that if the Spanish did not eliminate the fort, he would. The governor replied that he did not have the forces to take the fort. Jackson assigned Brigadier General Edmund Pendleton Gaines to take control of the fort. Gaines directed Colonel Duncan Lamont Clinch to build Fort Scott on the Flint River just north of the Florida border. Gaines said he intended to supply Fort Scott from New Orleans via the Apalachicola River, as this would mean passing through Spanish territory and past the Negro fort. It would allow the U.S. Army to keep an eye on the Seminole and the Negro fort. If the fort fired on the supply boats, the Americans would have an excuse to destroy it. In July 1816, U.S. supply fleet for Fort Scott reached the Apalachicola River. Clinch took a force of more than 100 American soldiers and about 150 Lower Creek warriors, including the chief Tuskegee Hutke, to protect the passage. The supply fleet met Clinch at the Negro fort, and its two gunboats took positions across the river from the fort. The blacks in the fort fired the cannon at the U.S. soldiers in the creek, but he had no training in aiming the weapon. The Americans fired back. The gunboat's ninth shot, a hot shot, landed in the fort's powder magazine. The explosion leveled the fort and was heard more than 100 miles away in Pensacola. Of the 320 people known to be in the fort, including women and children, more than 250 died instantly, and many more died from their injuries soon after. Once the U.S. Army destroyed the fort, it withdrew from Spanish Florida. American squatters and outlaws raided the Seminole, killing villages and stealing the cattle. Seminole resentment grew and they retaliated by stealing back the cattle. On February 24, 1817, a raiding party killed Mrs. Garrett, a woman living in Camden County, Georgia, and her two young children. Foultown and the Scott Massacre. Foultown was a Miccosukee village in southwestern Georgia, about 15 miles east of Fort Scott. Chief Neamathler of Foultown got into a dispute with the commander of Fort Scott over the use of land on the eastern side of the Flint River, essentially claiming Miccosukee sovereignty over the area. The land in southern Georgia had been ceded by the Creeks in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, but the Miccosukees did not consider themselves Creek, did not feel bound by the treaty, and did not accept that the Creeks had any right to cede Miccosukee land. In November 1817, General Gaines sent a force of 250 men to seize Foultown. The first attempt was beaten off by the Miccosukees. The next day, November 22, 1817, the Miccosukees were driven from the village. Some historians date the start of the war to this attack on Foultown. David Bridie Mitchell, former governor of Georgia and Creek Indian agent at the time, stated in a report to Congress that the attack on Foultown was the start of the First Seminole War. A week later, a boat carrying supplies for Fort Scott, under the command of Lt. Richard W. Scott, was attacked on the Apalachicola River. There were 40 to 50 people on the boat, including 26 soldiers, 7 wives of soldiers, and possibly some children. Most of the boat's passengers were killed by the Indians. 1 woman was taken prisoner, and 6 survivors made it to the fort. While General Gaines had been under orders not to invade Florida, he later decided to allow short intrusions into Florida. When news of the Scott Massacre on the Apalachicola reached Washington, Gaines was ordered to invade Florida and pursue the Indians, but not to attack any Spanish installations. However, Gaines had left for East Florida to deal with pirates who had occupied Fernandina. Secretary of War John C. Calhoun then ordered Andrew Jackson to lead the invasion of Florida. Jackson invades Florida. East Florida. Jackson gathered his forces at Fort Scott in March 1818, including 800 U.S. Army regulars, 1,000 Tennessee volunteers, 1,000 Georgia militia, and about 1,400 friendly Lower Creek warriors. On March 15, Jackson's army entered Florida, marching down the Apalachicola River. When they reached the site of the Negro Fort, Jackson had his men construct a new fort as Fort Gadsden. The army then set out for the Miccosukee villages around Lake Miccosukee. The Indian town of Tallahassee was burned on March 31, and the town of Miccosukee was taken the next day. More than 300 Indian homes were destroyed. Jackson then turned south, reaching Fort St. Marks on April 6. At St. Marks, Jackson seized the Spanish fort. There he found Alexander George Arbuthnot, a Scottish trader working out of the Bahamas. He traded with the Indians in Florida and had written letters to British and American officials on behalf of the Indians. He was rumored to be selling guns to the Indians and to be preparing them for war. He probably was selling guns, since the main trade item of the Indians was deer skins, and they needed guns to hunt the deer. Two Indian leaders, Josiah Francis, a Red Stick Creek, also known as the Prophet, and Homath Lemiko, had been captured when they had gone out to an American ship flying the British Union flag that he had anchored off of St. Marks. As soon as Jackson arrived at St. Marks, the two Indians were brought ashore and hanged without trial. Jackson left St. Marks to attack villages along the Suwannee River, which were occupied primarily by fugitive slaves. On April 12, the army found a Red Stick village on the Econfina River and attacked it. Close to 40 Red Sticks were killed, and about 100 women and children were captured. In the village, they found Elizabeth Stewart, the woman who had been captured in the attack on the supply boat on the Apalachicola River the previous November. The army found the villages on the Suwannee empty, many of the black Seminoles having escaped to Tampa Bay to the maroon community of Angola. Having destroyed the major Seminole and black villages, Jackson declared victory and sent the Georgia militiamen and the Lower Creeks home. The remaining army then returned to Fort St. Marks. About this time, Robert Ambrister, a former Royal Marine and self-appointed British agent, was captured by Jackson's army. At St. Marks, a military tribunal was convened, and Ambrister and Arbuthnot were charged with aiding the Seminoles and the Spanish, inciting them to war and leading them against the United States. Ambrister threw himself on the mercy of the court, while Arbuthnot maintained his innocence, saying that he had only been engaged in legal trade. The tribunal sentenced both men to death, but then relented and changed Ambrister's sentence to 50 lashes and a year at hard labor. Jackson, however, reinstated Ambrister's death penalty. Ambrister was executed by a firing squad on April 29, 1818. Arbuthnot was hanged from the yardarm of his own ship. Jackson left a garrison at Fort St. Marks and returned to Fort Gadsden. Jackson had first reported that all was peaceful and that he would be returning to Nashville, Tennessee. West Florida. General Jackson later reported that Indians were gathering and being supplied by the Spanish, and he left Fort Gadsden with 1,000 men on May 7, headed for Pensacola. The governor of West Florida protested that most of the Indians at Pensacola were women and children and that the men were unarmed. But Jackson did not stop. When he reached Pensacola on May 23, the governor and the 175-man Spanish garrison retreated to Fort Barrancas, leaving the city of Pensacola to Jackson. The two sides exchanged cannon fire for a couple of days, and then the Spanish surrendered Fort Barrancas on May 28. Jackson left Colonel William King as military governor of West Florida and went home. consequences. There were international repercussions to Jackson's actions. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams had just started negotiations with Spain for the purchase of Florida. Spain protested the invasion and seizure of West Florida and suspended the negotiations. Spain did not have the means to retaliate against the United States or regain West Florida by force, so Adams let the Spanish officials protest, then issued a letter blaming the war on the British, Spanish, and Indians. In the letter he also apologized for the seizure of West Florida, said that it had not been American policy to seize Spanish territory, and offered to give St. Marks and Pensacola back to Spain. Spain accepted and eventually resumed negotiations for the sale of Florida, defending Jackson's actions as necessary, and sensing that they strengthened his diplomatic standing. Adams demanded Spain either control the inhabitants of East Florida or cede it to the United States. An agreement was then reached whereby Spain ceded East Florida to the United States and renounced all claim to West. Britain protested the execution of two of its subjects who had never entered United States territory. There was talk in Britain of demanding reparations and taking reprisals. Americans worried about another war with Britain. In the end, Britain, realizing how important the United States was to its economy, opted for maintaining good relations. There were also repercussions in America. Congressional committees held hearings into the irregularities of the Armistice and Arbuthnot trials. While most Americans supported Jackson, some worried that Jackson could become a man on horseback, a Napoleon, and transform the United States into a military dictatorship. When Congress reconvened in December 1818, resolutions were introduced condemning Jackson's actions. Jackson was too popular, and the resolutions failed, but the Armistice and Arbuthnot executions left a stain on his reputation for the rest of his life, although it was not enough to keep him from becoming president.